It's common knowledge among the galactic scholars that humans were one of the few species unable to regenerate tissue. Professor Omazi was one such scholar. He had never been to Earth, but liked to echo the prevailing views of the galactic community. Perhaps this particular worldview stemmed from the fact that Omazi himself was a Blolib, a member of the Blob faction. The Blolibs were fascinating creatures, beings without any particular form who could effortlessly assume a bipedal shape when the need arose to interact with other species. Their amorphous nature granted them an almost casual relationship with physical injury. They could lose substantial chunks of themselves without suffering any meaningful losses whatsoever. The severed portions would simply dissolve into base nutrients while the main body adjusted its mass distribution accordingly. Even now, as Professor Omazi stood before his class preparing to begin his lecture, half of his gelatinous mass remained hidden behind the lectern, pooling and rippling like mercury as he paced. His visible upper portion had taken on a vaguely humanoid torso, complete with pseudopod arms that gestured expressively, though the illusion ended where the lectern concealed his lower mass. "Welcome, students, to another session of competitive xenobiology." Omazi began his lecture, his voice emerging from specialized vibration cells near what would be his chest region. "As promised, today's topic will continue our exploration of Death Worlders, just like our previous class." He paused, allowing a ripple of anticipation to run through his form, a Blolib equivalent of clearing one's throat. "The focus of this class will be examining the curious case of humans and their inability to regenerate tissue." As he spoke, Omazi's limited vision registered only blurred rows of occupied furniture, shadows within shadows. But his chemical senses captured something intriguing, a hint of different pheromones in the air, something sharp and mammalian that he couldn't quite place. There was an undertone of something else, too, a scent that reminded him of iron and salt, with traces of adrenaline metabolites that suggested an aggressive species. He dismissed it as perhaps a carnivorous student having a stressful day. "Now, as we discussed last week, Death Worlders are species that evolved on planets with extreme conditions that would kill most civilized beings," Omazi continued, his pseudopods gesturing broadly. "Humans are particularly fascinating because despite evolving on a Class 12 Death World, with its crushing gravity, volatile weather, and aggressive megafauna, they lack one of the most basic survival adaptations: tissue regeneration." The professor was just warming to his subject, preparing to launch into his prepared lecture about the evolutionary oddity of human healing, when suddenly a student rose from their seat. The motion was abrupt enough that even Omazi's poor vision registered the movement. What had been a vague blur among other blurs suddenly resolved into the form of a bipedal creature standing with obvious purpose. The figure's hands moved to what Omazi's chemical senses told him was synthetic fabric, and then, to the professor's shock, the creature began removing its garments. "Professor," a voice said, firm and containing an edge of challenge that made Omazi's mass quiver, "I'm afraid you're wrong about that." The human, for Omazi's chemical senses now confirmed what his eyes could not, stood shirtless before the class. "My name is Rich," he said, pointing at his abdomen, "and I can prove that humans can indeed regenerate tissue." Something about the human's tone, the absolute certainty in his voice, triggered an extreme response in Professor Omazi. Without conscious thought, his cellular structure began reorganizing itself, millions of photoreceptive cells migrating and clustering together. In a process that would have been agonizing for any creature with a centralized nervous system, Omazi formed a single, fully functional eye in the center of what served as his face. The world snapped into sharp focus for the first time during the lecture. What he saw made his newly formed eye widen in surprise. The human's torso was a road map of healed wounds, a painting of scars that told tales of survival. There was a long, silvery line running diagonally across his chest, clearly from some kind of blade. Several smaller, circular scars peppered his left side, their edges slightly puckered in a way that suggested projectile wounds. But most impressive was a massive scar across his abdomen, the tissue there different in texture and color, speaking of some grievous injury that by all rights should have been fatal. "Well, Omazi stammered, his voice losing its usual professorial confidence. His eye darted between the human scarred form and the suddenly very attentive class. "What I meant, of course, was that humans cannot regenerate limbs or organs, not mere tissue. The distinction is quite important in xenobiological terms." He could see in the eyes of his students, now that he had an eye to see with, that they were not having it. Several were leaning forward in their adaptive chairs, antennae moving quickly or similar appendages showing signs of interest and amusement. A few were already manipulating their personal devices, likely looking up human healing capabilities on the galactic net. The whisper in the third row had turned a shade of purple that Omazi knew indicated barely suppressed laughter. "Actually, Professor, that's fascinating." A new voice rang out, melodious and with a slight rasp that suggested reptilian vocal cords. A draconic student rose from her seat with fluid grace. Dravara was well known in the class, a draconid whose people prided themselves on their warrior culture and physical prowess. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her scales a deep emerald that caught the light like jewels. Her bipedal form was both beautiful and strong, with powerful legs ending in taloned feet, arms corded with visible muscle beneath her scales, and wings folded elegantly against her back. Her eyes, golden with vertical pupils, fixed on the human with unmistakable interest. "It's as if you can keep track of each battle you fought," Dravara said, moving closer to get a better look at Rich's scars. Her tail swayed behind her in what Omazi recognized as excitement. "Your body creates a permanent record of your survival. That's actually cool. My people shed and regrow scales, so our battle marks are temporary. But you carry your history on your skin." Rich turned toward her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he said, clearly appreciating her perspective. But then his attention returned to the professor, and the smile faded. "But I'm still not letting you off the hook, Professor. You said humans can't regenerate organs, but that's wrong too. Us humans can regenerate our liver. Up to 70% of it can be removed and it will grow back. And skin is technically an organ too, the largest one we have, so we can regenerate organs." Professor Omazi felt his carefully maintained form begin to sag slightly. His newly formed eye, which had seemed like such a good idea moments ago, now felt like a curse as he could see clearly the expressions on his students' faces. They had all witnessed him double down on his incorrect statement and still be wrong. Several were now openly searching on their devices, and he could see them finding confirmation of the human's claims. The ferrite in the front row was particularly vibrating with second-hand embarrassment, and the Verdinian's floral scent had turned sour with disappointment. Yes, well..." Omazi tried to salvage something from the situation, but words failed him. His eye wandered desperately around the room, looking for something, anything to redirect the class's attention. Dravara, however, seemed oblivious to the professor's distress. She had moved even closer to Rich, her golden eyes tracing the patterns of his scars with scientific interest. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward his torso. "I'd like to feel the texture difference. For academic purposes, of course." Rich regarded her from head to toe, taking in her impressive stature and smiling. After a moment's consideration, he shrugged. "Sure." The rest of the class became extraordinarily awkward after that. Dravara's examination of the human scars was thorough and accompanied by a running commentary about tissue density, flexibility, and how impressive it was he had won so many battles. Rich answered her questions with a mixture of amusement and patience, occasionally wincing when she pressed too hard on a particularly sensitive area. The other students were far more interested in what the duo was discussing than anything Professor Omazi might have to say about human physiology. The professor made several attempts to regain control of his classroom, but each time he began to speak, another student would ask Rich a question about his injuries, or Dravara would make another observation about human healing. When the torture was finally over and the students filed out, Rich pulling his shirt back on while Dravara continued her questions about humanity's warrior culture, to which Rich simply replied that he was, in fact, a man of culture. Omazi let his form collapse fully behind the lectern. His eye dissolved back into his mass, returning him to the comforting blur of chemical sensations. As the last footsteps faded from the classroom, Omazi realized that perhaps it was time he put his own research in order. He had been teaching about Deathworlders for 3 cycles now, but how much of his information came from actual study versus simply repeating what he'd heard in faculty lounges and academic gossip circles? The human scars had been a perfect example not just of survival, but of adaptation and healing that he had fundamentally misunderstood. Maybe, he thought as he oozed towards his office, it was time to investigate better the subjects he gave lectures on, and maybe, just a weak and pitiful maybe, he should start by actually visiting Earth.